you've got to have a
Hard stop?
hard stop because he's got to fly to catch back to DC.
Okay. What happens at 10:30? Like, is there an alarm that will go off? Or?
Hopefully
Veronica will say time's up,
Run a
right?
terrible life.
So, as you recall from last time you were here, we'd love to give you the opening statement. Tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll ask you some questions, and I'm sure the 45 minutes will fly by.
Good. Well, thanks very much for everybody for your time today. I'm here to appeal to you, and I'm here to induce you to engage substantively as an editorial board on behalf of fundamental tax reform. And here's why. I really think we're at an inflection point in our country. We're going to do one of two things in the next few weeks. We're either going to pass what I would argue is a transformational tax reform policy, or this is going to be the biggest fish that ever got away. And the more time I've spent in this milieu, the more time I've spent around this issue, the more I'm convinced that the status quo is a loser and we cannot stay here. And I personally am out of the all or nothing business. I think that if you're in the all or nothing business, you get nothing every time. There are growth-oriented things in this bill that I think can be incredibly significant for us. Just to take a step back and look at this more philosophically, I really think, and I've said this several times publicly in the hearings, and I've said it at press events, but it bears repeating. I think that there's two views of the economy that are really competing for the affections of the American people right now. One is a view that I reject. It's a zero-sum game view of the economy that says if somebody is successful, it comes at the demise of someone else. I don't believe that. The other way is to say, no, it's not a zero-sum game. As the economy grows, it's good for people around and so forth. Now, there's a sensitivity on the distributional side of things. But what this bill, H.R. 1, is designed to do is to pursue growth and to pursue economic activity and to pursue churn. And I think the data bears that out. But if people step back and say, well, let's just defend the status quo. And interestingly, that was all of the amendments that were offered during the Ways and Means markup last week was all defend the status quo, replace this, replace this, replace this. And there's a great temptation to look at these things in isolation and to say, well, if this goes away, then that's the only thing that happens. Well, that's an obtuse way of evaluating something. Of course, the tax reform plan has to be evaluated in its totality. And so I think we're on the threshold of something incredibly significant. And I'll give you two data points. They're anecdotes, but they're significant, and there's power in the anecdotes. One is the CEO of AT&T last week announced publicly, he said if H.R. 1 passes as proposed, AT&T will invest an additional $1 billion in the U.S. economy that they wouldn't invest. There was a manufacturing company that I have a relationship with out near my constituency, and I was in a couple months ago talking to them about expensing in particular. Family company, successful, and I happened to be in with them as they were doing some of their capital expenditure planning, and they had a whiteboard up. They pointed to the whiteboard and they said, Peter, we're planning on spending $30 million next year in terms of capital expenditures. If we have full expensing, that number will be $50 million. So what I'm describing to you is a downstroke on investment and churn. And on the international side of things, this is really hitting this city and it's really hitting this region. We are losing this on an international basis. We're the only large economy in the world, as you know, that taxes on a worldwide basis. We have to move to a territorial system. If we move to a territorial system and move at a reasonable rate in terms of repatriation, and what we've proposed is 7 and 14%, 7 for cash and 7 for non-cash and 14 for cash, that money comes back, and then there's never a lockout effect, again, from a tax point of view, as we move forward. So I think that we're on the verge of something that could be incredibly significant. I urge you, I'm here, I am appealing to you to weigh in on behalf of this. And I'm not here saying, hey, everything about HR1 is perfect. But what I'm saying is, this is a good plan. And if we step back and say, well, we're waiting for perfect, perfect's never coming. We're waiting for something else is never coming. Absent some other event that will happen in the future that's not foreseeable, you're never going to get the confluence of events that you have right now in terms of momentum that can get a significant tax reform effort that's growth-oriented on a president's desk that can be signed into law in the foreseeable future. So that's why I wanted to meet today. I am appealing to you to engage and to advocate on behalf of this plan.
Thank you. One of the questions I'd like to start with is the sense of urgency that I've sensed from you and others in the Republican Party. I was looking back at the '86 bill, which is the last time Congress really radically or fundamentally changed tax law. That effort took a couple of years and it passed with bipartisan support. The Senate vote was actually 97-3. So I'm asking why such a hurry and why was this not constructed as a bipartisan bill to begin with?
So it's not in a hurry. So go back, this started really, I've been on the committee, it started under Dave Camp when he was chairman. And Dave Camp put together what was known at that time as the Camp draft on tax reform. It was actual language. It was not just talking points and white papers, but it was actual language that was a comprehensive approach. Here's what we learned from the Camp draft. There were two self-imposed limitations that became debilitating. The self-imposed limitations were strict distributional neutrality. In other words, you couldn't change any element of the distributional table. And the other was revenue neutrality on a static basis. In other words, you couldn't consider the dynamic changes that tax policy would induce. Tax policy obviously changes behavior, but you couldn't put that into a consideration. So we did all this work with those two self-imposed limitations and came up with something that was not satisfying. In other words, you couldn't get, it didn't give you growth. And as I said before, growth is really something that's worth pursuing. So to look at HR1, this bill that we're talking about today, outside of the context of previous efforts, is to isolate it from things that have influenced it. So there's been dozens of hearings and dozens of working groups and dozens of roundtable discussions on a bipartisan basis that are significant. Now, you got to make a threshold decision here, and the threshold decision one needs to make is how hard do you want to pursue growth? And if somebody says, I'm willing to chase growth with you, then what we've tried to do is to be sensitive on the distributional side, which is why, look, the Washington Post earlier last week came out with 4 Pinocchios for some senators who were tweeting out, this is not helping the middle class. It was just not true, and they got called out on it. So there's a sensitivity on the distributional side as it relates to middle income relief. But I wouldn't characterize this as being hurried. I would characterize it, though, as being urgent. And I'm not trying to parse in my language, but the urgency is essentially a collapsing window of time. So you turn the corner into 2018, nothing gets easier for all the obvious reasons. And there's an urgency to this. And I would stipulate further that there are some companies that are waiting. They're just waiting to see what's going to be happening from a business point of view. And if we don't move, for example, to a territorial system within a reasonable period of time, they will leave. Remember, Richie Daley had a line that he said, companies don't necessarily tell you they're going to leave. They just leave. So when Aon, a couple of blocks from here, moved a few years ago, and they repatriated to the UK, largely based on tax policy, they just did it, and the ripple effect of that is incredibly significant. There was a story, I think you guys covered it a couple weeks ago, about a company that was leaving. I can't give you chapter and verse, but $1 billion or $2 billion company in Chicago that's leaving based on tax policy.
Congressman, with all respect, tax policies is the ultimate. You have to have the details to know what it does. A detailed plan was first, with all the dots and everything else, was first put out last Thursday, I believe. The thing hasn't even been scored by CBO. Don't you understand when people look at this and say, hey, give us some time to run these things and do our projections and do the analysis and figure out how this affects us, see whether it really is good or not?
Yeah, I mean, that's I guess, you can, it depends on where you want your emphasis is. There's nothing that's really new under the sun that we're contemplating here. There's no, I would agree with you if the border tax were in there, for example, border adjustment tax. That's new, it's a concept that had not been well discussed and well understood. But most of these other concepts have been out within general tax discussions for quite some time. And this will all be vetted out. So the committee did a markup, 4 days. There's been a prelude in terms of hearing after hearing after hearing. So one runs the risk of over contemplating, it almost becomes debilitating. So at some point,
It's debilitating to wait for CBO.
no, it's not debilitating to wait for CBO to get the score. But joint tax has been involved in this, Greg, as you know, throughout this entire process. They've been going back and forth 4 days with the director of joint tax. So it's not as if people are going into this blindly. And look at the groups that are supporting it. The manufacturers, the chamber, the NFIB, who all vetted this language vis-a-vis their own membership, and they're coming out strongly in favor of it.
You mentioned that you're not in the all or nothing business anymore, so, given that, we've talked solely about the corporate tax rate, really, in this conversation so far. Is there anything that you'd be willing to throw overboard in order to get the corporate tax rate that you want?
So we proposed a 20% corporate rate and to make it permanent. So in light of that, what's your question?
I'm wondering, you've mainly talked about the corporate tax rate. Are there other, it sounds to me like that's the most important element of this plan, given the fact that you've emphasized pretty much that.
Right.
Is there anything else in the plan that you'd be willing to throw overboard to get the corporate tax rate?
Well, there's other things that are important. So I don't want to, I want to be careful in how I would answer a question like that. I think the expensing side of this is incredibly important. And I mentioned that the constituent company that said they are willing to move forward if there's full expensing, for example. The R&D tax credit being permanent. These are other attributes. The repatriation rate, for example, at 7% and 14%. Those are all calibrations that are made to try and figure out how you land in terms of taking on debt and what the score is and so forth. So I guess in order to more fully answer your question, it would be in exchange for what? So if you're proposing to eliminate something that we've proposed, the question would be, well, okay, but what's the trade-off, or where do we go from there?
One of the critiques of the plan that I've read since it's come to light, though, is that it tends to reward inherited or invested wealth as opposed to those who rely on making a living, working to earn what they...
Capital versus labor.
Do you have any thoughts about that, or how do you defend the plan based on that criticism?
Well, I wholeheartedly defend the plan. But I mean, in answer to your question, look at the individual rates. So for example, the individual rates, which are taxes on labor, are all coming down. So the elimination of the 10% rate to zero, the first rate being 12, and then 25 and 35, and keeping the top rate at 39.6, is all a reflection of the valuation of labor, doubling the standard deduction, and then the other family policies that are cooked in. But there's also a recognition that you've got to incentivize investment, and that's what happens on the permanency on the rate. There's also a design feature internally within pass-throughs that's trying to distinguish out business income from compensation. And so for the first time ever, getting a business income rate down to 25%, which would be a historic rate down to World War II levels.
You appeared to suggest in your op-ed last week that no taxpayer would lose from this on balance, that everybody would come out ahead. They'd be taking home more than they are now. Is that indeed what you're saying?
What I'm saying is, and you and I, Greg, have had 3 conversations about this within one conversation, but kind of 3 times when I've tried to communicate what I'm saying, is...
I'm quoting from your op-ed.
Well, what I'm communicating is this. The notion that tax reform is evaluated not in totality is obtuse. And this is the discussion that you and I had on the phone not long ago. In other words, taking away, so we had a big debate in the Ways and Means Committee, for example, of the elimination of the deductibility for teachers of their school supplies. And when it all comes down to it, teachers have an above-the-line deduction under current law, which is worth about $250. You put that against a 15% tax rate, and it's worth about $37.50 after you keep all of your receipts all year long. And so we heard a lot of demagoguery during the course of the debate that said, well, you don't care about this group, that group, or the other group. We said, of course we do. What we're doing is we're doubling the standard deduction, and we're doing all these other things within tax reform. So my point is this. You and I had a discussion about state and local and so forth. Mm-hmm. And what I'm saying is my district, in my view, benefits from this tax reform package.
But just everybody in the district.
Look, how can you no one can answer that question because you have no idea what, and if that's the standard, there's no way that you can ever do fundamental tax reform if that's the standard. You don't know how many electric cars somebody has or how many, every single circumstance.
So I just want to try to understand what you're saying. So you're saying that even if certain, beloved deductions that a number of the constituents in your district currently enjoy go away, that they will, in totality, benefit from what you presume to be an uptick in investment and general economic activity that lifts all boats through this entire plan.
Exactly.
So to buy that, one has to buy a theory of economics that has, as far as I'm aware, not proven true in the real
What's that?
world. Trickle down economics.
Look, look at the folks who were invested in all of the pension funds. These are modest income people by and large who benefit what? When their 401ks go up, when the teachers' pensions funds go up. So the notion that somehow there's this divorce between wage income and capital activity is a false notion. It's not divorced. They're interrelated.
Except the vast majority of working people don't have pensions and don't.
Even beyond that, Congressman, the tax policy centers concluded, he said nobody can say whether each individual is going to gain or not, that that's obtuse, but they conclude that in 2018, 7% of taxpayers will pay more than they're paying now, and that by 2027, 25%, 1/4 of taxpayers will pay.
Which version of the tax policy center? They had one that was out, and they had
this
to
is the
withdraw it because
This
they were.
is the correct.
Right. Well, I've not seen their latest, but they were.
Are they wrong?
Well, I don't agree. I can't comment on a corrected version of something that was released and then pulled back in the middle of the markup.
Well, let me put the notion different. Take 2 families, each earning $150,000 a year, which is a little bit above the need for your district.
We're 135.
They got a couple kids. They pay property taxes. They pay sales taxes, whatever. If one of those families is in Alabama, isn't it true that there are odds that they're going to come away with more money, considerably better than if that family lives in your district, because the folks in your district pay a local tax rate that doesn't apply in somewhere else? Aren't they worse off, relatively?
But they're not worse off. So
why not?
You're pitting this.
They don't live in Alabama, number one.
I yield to the gentleman.
Why not?
I'm not buying it. You've gone this route with me now 4 times, and I am not persuaded by your logic. It makes no sense to me, with all due respect. And I think that if that's the standard, then you're never going to get anywhere. then just throw the towel in. There's no way to do tax reform if this simply becomes a geographic contest. I think my district says, look, I'm interested in tax relief. I'm not concerned about Alabama. They're interested in them. What's going on in their district? What's going on with their tax liability? What's going on with their prosperity?
Don't the people in your district want to be treated just the same as the people in Alabama and not have tax and not effectively be double taxed?
I am not seeing my constituents being upset about what's happening in Alabama.
No, I guess.
And I've heard from a lot of people on a lot of issues, and Alabama's not one.
Let me just try to rephrase Greg's question. I think he's getting at the state and local tax deduction. In Alabama, that isn't much of an issue because the taxes there are much lower than they are here. So your constituents would lose the ability to write off what they paid in state income tax and property tax. Are your constituents upset about losing that deduction?
But this is the point that I've made and I will continue to make. I think people evaluate tax policy in totality. In other words, I think my constituents are interested, what kind of tax relief am I going to be getting from this? And how does this grow the economy? And they're less concerned about the equation by which they get there. So if what's happening is they're being offered relief on individual rates, the elimination of the alternative minimum tax, which gets 30,000+ of my constituents, increasing the child tax credit, creating a family credit for the first time ever, and all in, they look at that and the elimination, the continued elimination of up to $10,000 of property tax liability. All in, that is a good equation for my constituents. I am not hearing from people, with all due respect, who are concerned about what's the guy in Alabama planning. I'm just not hearing that. And I've heard a lot of things from a lot of people,
right.
But I've not heard the Alabama argument.
No, I understand that. I was just versus the status quo where right now they could write off all of the money they're paying in property tax.
Right, so go back to the teacher example. Yeah, a teacher can write off $250 of receipts that they keep during the year. But what's that actually worth? It's actually worth. Well, no. But let me finish my point.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an easy thing. And during the course of the Ways and Means meeting, by the way, that wasn't perceived or communicated as a de minimis amount. It was, teachers are going to be just thunderstruck basically by this. It was overcharacterized and it was hyped. So in the same way, I think my constituents have said, look, they're scandalized by their property taxes. They're not as scandalized by other taxes. I just think that there's something visceral that people feel, particularly about property taxes, because property taxes are unrelated to your ability to pay them. And I think that chafes people in a way that's really significant. So that said, I think it's a reasonable thing to maintain the property tax deduction, but when it all comes down to it, there has to be an element of compromise where people come together and say, we've got to reason together as a country to come up with something that's reasonable and fair and moves us in the right direction. And again, if it's an all or nothing.
I think Steve's been trying to get in on this.
In terms of the details of this, there are some choices made about who gives up things to pay for all of this. Some of the choices, and you mentioned this is perfect at the outset. No. I'd be interested in hearing from you what you think is not perfect. And also, I'm going to bring up something in particular. You've got complete estate tax repeal in this bill, and yet you're charging endowments of U of C and Northwestern a tax on their gains, which basically is taking away money for financial aid for students at two really important economic engines in the city. You also tax, for instance, grad students, again, hitting the U of C very hard, which gives tuition waivers routinely to grad students who would then have to pay thousands of dollars of tax on something that, the very definition of a grad student is somebody who's eating ramen noodles in their crummy apartment. Some of the choices here are very strange. So giving a state tax repeal to the wealthiest people in this country and taxing grad students, for instance, seems really strange. So
I would say,
let me ask you, what are the things that are imperfect about this?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. So I'm not going to argue against the bill. So I'm not going to play that game. But I take your point, and I agree with you, and I think what is likely to happen in the Senate is that the estate tax, for example, is not completely repealed. I think what you're likely to see coming out of the Senate is going to be some sort of cap that particularly deals with ranchers and farmers, because that's a significant issue that is not that is not a day-to-day issue here that we're dealing with. There's also a sensitivity. So you're a second-generation company and you're in Carroll Stream. We want to have some sort of pass-through capacity, not like a sub-S pass-through, but some sort of generational pass-through capacity. But in answer to your question, could I vote in favor of a higher, keeping the estate tax, for example? Absolutely, and raising the deduction. So I think that there's those types of things, and this is where House and Senate are in play together, and the Senate has said they like some of the things that we're proposing. They don't like some of the things. We have a 20% corporate rate, for example, starting right January 1. They said we prefer to phase it in. I don't know if they do something. They've got more rates than we're proposing. So, I mean, I'm not going to argue against our bill, but I'm the first one to say it's not perfect, but it's good. And my cautionary tale is, if we are chasing perfect, and if you decide not to engage, which is why I'm here and I'm appealing to you, then here's what happens. It basically dithers into nothing. And we'll end up wringing our hands, and we won't have what could be really significant pro-growth tax policy.
Sounds a little like Obamacare, let's get rid of it no matter what, otherwise.
Well, the inverse is also true. It sounds like Obamacare. Let's pass it and it will be all fantastic. Overhype, overcharacterization. If you like your doctor, you can keep it. If you like your physician, you can keep them. Every family's going to save $2,500 a year.
It radically changed healthcare, which needed a change, which is exactly what you're saying about tax policy.
Yeah, but I'm not gonna concede that one policy is equal to the other policy for all the obvious.
Is keeping the $10,000 deduction for property taxes a must-have?
I think so. I mean, I think that it is. It's born of compromise, and to move beyond that would. I think we need to keep it.
I think if we're going to do as you ask and engage in this and support it, we're going to need to understand a little better what this does, what your proposal, forget the Senate, does to the deficit.
So it borrows $1.5 trillion. It's very straightforward. It borrows $1.5 trillion over 10 years. That's what it does.
Why?
Well, because you can't get there in terms of getting the type of growth that you want to get if you don't do it.
What type of growth are you anticipating getting for
Well,
borrowing $1.5 billion?
The Tax Foundation has said that in Illinois alone, what you'll do is create 40,000 jobs in a decade. So that's worth chasing.
How do you pay it down?
Well, you get a better tax code and you get a better economy as a result. So this is the dynamic scoring nature of this. So one of Greg's criticisms was that it hasn't been scored by joint tax. It has been scored by joint tax all the way through this process. And when it's, so anyways, the point is that this needs to be evaluated on a dynamic basis. So go back to the camp draft that I mentioned a minute ago. We learned a hard lesson from the camp draft. And the hard lesson was, if things are evaluated just statically, then what good does that do? It's very difficult. It's a very difficult way to score things.
Why?
But in answer to your question, just so that we're clear, we're proposing to borrow $1.5 trillion, and with that, you get a new tax code.
Wouldn't it be beneficial because of the, and I only brought up one example, and there's people deducting their medical expenses in real hardship cases that are being taken. There's all kinds of really vulnerable people hit by this tax proposal. Why do you, everybody I think would agree that bringing corporate rates down to a lower level makes sense. I think everybody would agree. Why does it have to be 20? Why couldn't it be 25?
Well, so we went down, here's an answer to your question. Back in 1986, we got the lowest statutory corporate rate in the world. And then nothing happened for 30 years. And over time, we drifted and we lost. Now we're the highest statutory corporate rate. So the thinking is get as low as you can. 20 is not worldwide low. 20 gets us like in maybe number 3, don't hold my feet to the fire. It's low, but in all likelihood, we're going to continue to be competitive, and that the idea of getting it lower later, I don't think is realistic. Look, a lot of those things that you mentioned, for example, the deductibility of student interest, for example, that was in the Obama 2017 budget, or some of these other things that when you evaluate them in their entirety, I go back to this discussion that I had with Greg. If you go back and you evaluate them in their entirety, you find out, oh, they really are well taken care of with the doubling of the standard deduction and some of these other provisions. So the notion of simply evaluating a particular deduction and to take it out of context is not to create a complete picture. I take your point, and are there numbers that are not 20% that are reasonable? Of course there are. And so it could be that the Senate comes back at a different number. I hope they don't. I think
it's not there now,
right? I think 20% makes sense, and it's really worth pursuing from a competitiveness point of view, and that we'll be the beneficiaries of that. But I take your point. That's wherein lies sort of the choices.
Do you have any concern that with the territorial system, some territories, some countries have no local tax at all, or 1% or 2%, that you're still going to be open to gaming or companies moving their intellectual property whatever overseas and not being taxed at all?
Yes. So you put your finger on a big sensitivity here, and there's an irony in that while I'm arguing for complexity, or I'm arguing for simplicity, there's 2 elements of complexity that I'm introducing. One you talked about, Greg, and one I'll bring to your attention. There is what the bill contemplates is an anti-base erosion rule to deal with exactly what you pointed out. So in other words, you're a worldwide American company and you've got intellectual property. Doesn't matter where we put our rate, somebody's always going to be lower. So let's say you put your IP in Ireland at 12.5%. You move to a territorial system, you've got a pot trap. It's a disaster. And you would actually exacerbate the problem. It would make things worse. Because not only would you put the intellectual property there, but to legitimize it, you've got to build more jobs around it and so forth. Okay. So there's a provision that is in HR 1 that deals with that. In a nutshell, it says it evaluates on a worldwide basis the tax liability globally, all in. So it's all cumulative. But if you are in a low tax jurisdiction, there's an earnings trigger basically, or an income trigger that would attribute a tax to you. So that's the first thing. The second level of complexity within this overarching theme of simplicity, and I get the irony, is within pass-throughs in particular. So since we're proposing to distinguish between business income and wage income, that's more complicated than it looks. So the complication is what's a clear definition? Now you can do a couple of things. One is we proposed like a safe harbor test, 70-30. You can also, there's some companies that say, hey, 70-30 doesn't reflect my ratios. 70-30, we're way more capital intensive, or we're way more, we have a lot more business income than simply that threshold. We're proposing an equation by which a company can do that. Here's what we don't want to do. We don't want to just come up with a general theme and then leave it to the Internal Revenue Service to interpret the statute. So both of these things, the one that you mentioned, Greg, there's a real sensitivity to, because you can create basically a disaster where you would hemorrhage intellectual property and jobs. So you need something against that to mitigate against it. And then on the other side, for pass-throughs, they need a level of predictability that they can count on to distinguish between business and.
And I gather you think that the bill adequately deals with those.
Yeah, I do.
When we talked last, you had raised the possibility of holding an open meeting with your constituents to discuss all this.
So yeah, you always come. I love this. So I'm going to continue to represent the district the way I have represented the district. And so I've got a telephone town hall on it. I will continue to do that. I, have any number of meetings with different groups in the constituency. But if you're asking me, one of the big meetings where everybody comes in angry and leaves angrier, I'm not going to do that.
We've got probably about 5 minutes left.
It's the fastest.
I know,
Golly.
Could we ask you a few non-tax questions?
Well, how non-tax?
Well, Roy Moore.
yes.
I'm here to talk about taxes.
You don't have anything to say about whether or not.
I'm here to, I asked you today for this time
I know.
to talk about taxes. And I want you to write about taxes.
I understand.
I don't want to make headlines about anything other than taxes.
One of your colleagues from Illinois called.
I'm here to talk about taxes.
So you don't think you have a moral obligation to speak to this
I'm here
issue?
to talk about taxes.
We're
And to
talking-
induce you.
We're talking about someone who is accused of unspeakable acts, and you are not going to take this opportunity to comment on whether or not.
I will have plenty of opportunities to comment about all kinds of things.
Here's one.
I asked for this meeting to talk about taxes.
Oh. All right.
Let me try another one. How about DACA?
I'm here to talk about taxes. That's why I asked for the meeting. I want you to, I'm here to ask you to engage on this.
Back on taxes then. You mentioned if this drifts to 2018, all sorts of things the wheels could kind of fly off. So what is the timetable here? When must a vote happen, and how solid is the majority in the House and the Senate right now?
In terms of their disposition towards this bill?
Yes.
I'm of the view that this has to be, you basically have to land on this, and it's got to be signed by 2017, or, can you squeak into a little bit early 18, maybe, but the closer you get into 18 or to 18, it's not a good scene. So I think that we're gonna work hard to get this out of the House this week, and we'll get some feedback from members today and tomorrow. I think that the current thinking is to have a vote this week, and then we're waiting basically for the Senate to act. So the Senate, as you know, they do it differently on so many levels, but one of the things that they don't do is they don't introduce actual language. They introduce what's known as a virtual markup. So they will have a discussion and vote around concepts, and then direct their professional staff to draft a bill following that. We do it the other way. But the Senate needs at that point to work through their process. And I'm confident that this is likely to end up in a conference committee report for the obvious reasons of these different themes of trying to come to a compromise and move forward. But in answer to your question, House needs to deal with this week, ideally, and then the Senate needs to move something out of Senate Finance in their own timing.
Other than the estate tax, what other imperfect provisions would you like to see perhaps tinkered with a little bit?
You keep coaxing me to argue against my own bill, and I'm not going to do that. I will continue to advocate for HR 1.
What would make it more
Recognize-
perfect?
Oh, you guys are very good. Look, I think we're going to have a lot of opportunities to continue discussing this, because it's very, look, this is the way the system works. Is there's multiple feedback loops and so forth, lots of comments, lots of critiques, and I'll just give you an example. We did a meeting, and Kevin Brady, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, presented the business themes. I presented the individual themes, and then we switched groups and everybody came together. What was so interesting, I've been in a lot of these meetings over the years of House Republicans that usually end up in finger pointing and admonition, and they're a disaster. This felt totally different, and it was critique and observation and good faith suggestions and so forth. So I think that I think HR 1 is a good bill. I will stipulate that there are other people that are going to weigh in on this and are going to have opinions. And some of the critique we've heard so far, the Senate is going to have their opportunity to weigh in on this significantly. The state tax, I think, is one likely that there's going to be some changes. But I think all in, there's a lot of momentum behind this right now. And so just in closing, and I just want to look at each one of you, I'm here asking you to weigh in. And there's a temptation, I think, to be to step back and be agnostic about it. And I would urge you not to be agnostic. And I would hope that you would say, hey, this is on balance, this is a good plan, and let's move forward, and critiquing the things that you don't like, of course, but recognizing that we're really at an opportunity to do something significant. So,
Can I say one thing before?
Sure.
I mean, it's included. This is something that I'm going to just say, and I'm just interested in your reaction to it. One of the things that strikes me about the pay-fors in this bill is that a lot of it is aimed at Democratic states. And so a lot of the state and local taxes, mortgage interest that's higher than a certain level, tend to hit Democratic states much more than Republican states. In the Senate, there's very few senators representing those states that are Republicans. The only people representing significant constituencies in those states are in the House that are Republicans. So it's really up, in my opinion, to the House members to protect their constituencies in those states and not to be in their zeal or their ardor to get finally this Trojan, this thing that they wanted to get accomplished for so long, to just sell important constituencies down the river in order to do that. So you're one of the few who's in that position, and that's I just would be interested.
I take that admonition seriously, which is why property taxes is in HR 1, and I get the dynamic of what you're communicating. There's an irony here too, just in terms of criticism. Some Illinois Democrats have been critical of this, saying it's raising taxes and so forth. But this is a group of people that was silent or complicit when their party basically jammed through a massive tax on the middle class earlier this year. So, I describe them as having crocodile tears in their criticism of this. They were only too willing to see a really significant tax hike on the middle class. But I understand the nature of your admonition, and I accept it.
Did you put in the transit break?
Pardon me?
Did you put the transit break in?
Hey, it's all part of life's rich tapestry.
I'm just kind of curious where that came from.